Right, hi everyone. So I am here today with the group who performed a scene from the Persa. So I think we'll begin with introductions, pronouns, and then we'll take it from there. So from left to right.
All right. I'm Sarah Brucia Breitenfeld, they, them, and I played Sagaristio in the Persa.
Hi, I'm Alex Creighton, he or they, and I played the Weirgo.
I'm Lauren Ginsberg, she, her, and I played Dordalis the Lano.
I'm Rebecca Stone Thornberry, she, her, and I played Toxilus.
All right. So could one of you give us maybe a synopsis of the scene of the Persa and kind of place it in a broader context?
Sure, I can give that a try. It's always fun to kind of try to summarize Roman comedy because all of the plots kind of overlap. But the scene that we were assigned has Toxilus and Sagaristio trying to pull one over on the Lano character, Dordalis. And to do that, they are going to use a citizen girl, the unnamed Weirgo, and they are going to try to trick him into purchasing this citizen girl. On the premise that she and Sagaristio, they're both in truth Greek, but they're going to try to pretend to be and pass as Persians in order to sell this quote-unquote Persian girl to the Lano character, to Dordalis, in the hopes of kind of entrapping him, but also getting the money. And they're going to use the money that they acquire from selling this girl to buy Toxilus's girlfriend eventually. That doesn't come into our scene. And the girl will, of course, end up being free by the end of the play. She is not actually an enslaved girl. So this is a scene of deception, and it's also a scene of meta-theater where we have a performance where Toxilus's character, the Weirgo character, and Sagaristio are all putting on a performance for the benefit of Dordalis, the pimp character.
Or the lack of benefit.
Or the lack of benefit, exactly. And so this is kind of an unusual play for a few reasons. One is that our lover character is Toxilus, who's an enslaved character. And it's also unusual for having the Weirgo character, the girl character, speak quite a bit on stage, which is what our scene kind of staged. Anything to add or to correct from that?
That's great.
Yeah. I think it is interesting that all the characters sort of have their own vision of what that play within a play should be. And so we also see some tensions in the meta theater where everyone is sort of messing with it, and luckily Dordalis doesn't notice.
All right, thank you. No, thank you. That's very helpful. So, and maybe all of you can answer this. The process of staging this scene. So you were assigned the scene, and then bam, you know what happened next?
Rebecca, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I think when we were staging the scene, since it's a 4-person scene, that can be difficult to figure out where people are on stage, where they need to be. And since we were doing it collaboratively, so there really wasn't like one person who was staging the scene, we sort of worked a lot with figuring out where our characters wanted to go, and then we kind of cleaned up that blocking. It's made more difficult by the fact that we're wearing masks, and many of us wear corrective lenses, which we could not wear in the masks. So we were seeing the mask itself really compromises your vision because the eye holes are pretty small, so you have really no peripheral vision. And then without glasses on, I at least was just seeing kind of like blurry shapes. And even then not always seeing the blurry shapes.
Mm-hmm.
You also have to keep your face out when you're working with the mask a lot of times. So things that you might play more naturalistically towards somebody, you really have to play as if you're talking to them. There's a lot of like neck movement, physical movement, from the body, and thought about how to turn the mask, how to listen in the mask, how to show without being fake or phony about it, what your character is doing, how to let those things come through the body. So we worked a lot with that, and with the masks, and that was primarily what I was most interested in seeing about the scene, how these masks work, how this could be funny, rhythm and timing, and the rhythm and timing are so much affected by the fact that you really can't see much. In two or three person scenes, it's a little easier because you're not navigating around quite as many people. And I think it was made a little more difficult because of the fact that there were 4 people on stage. So we didn't want the scene to become static, meaning that people were just kind of out there and kind of standing in their spots. We wanted some movement and things happening, but we also had to consider the amount of time we had, the amount of space we had, and how much we could really see to do that. Movements are also large, and you don't want to, misjudge where you are in relation to another person and, smack somebody in the face or something. So I think that was a big challenge, but I think that was one of the things that was most fun for me to work on.
Thank you. Yeah, Lauren.
Yeah, I think I was also very excited to work with the masks and to see how that would bring the characters alive in a different way than we would. I think for me, the most powerful moment that helped us figure out how we wanted to stage it was when we just did a couple of read-throughs, and all of a sudden we would realize your character is just silent for a long time, so what will you possibly be doing on stage that's still interesting? And then perhaps more, your character is just silenced at a certain point. Like, you're very chatty, and then all of a sudden become very quiet. And that made us wonder why. Like, what has happened in the performance of this scene where this, like, extremely performative, at least the way we read it, female character all of a sudden doesn't speak anymore, and people are speaking for it. And I think that actually became the kernel of what we decided to do with the scene in the end. And for me, as someone who primarily reads these scripts, that's not necessarily something I would notice just as reading, but when we were all reading it out loud, it became quite clear.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Alex.
Yeah, really just to echo what's already been said, but the process of reading aloud, and in particular reading each part aloud, was really interesting to me because I too have sort of approached things from a very textual angle. I'm just kind of reading them and doing my in my case, English major thing. But when you read each character separately, you start to realize that certain characters or certain lines or even certain affects just sort of stick with you in one way or another. And it was cool to see how that worked and to see what kind of performance felt like it would be possible and interesting to do. And then so much of what gets performed is not on the script at all. So while we are trying to find the right words and working with a couple different translations and sort of piecing bits together in order to get a script that we really feel happy with, so much of it is gestural performance, blocking, a term I didn't know before this institute and now know and understand. And it was so cool to see that come together because you say so much even when you're not, and sometimes especially when you're not saying words, but where you put yourself on the stage. And that was really cool to figure out. It was just fun to think about, like, where do bodies go on the stage? How does the scene evolve? And how can you transmit certain feelings based on an expression, or I guess in our case, the tilt of a head in a mask? Because I had the same reaction to the masks at first. I looked at it, it seemed such a static thing, but truly, you can make the mask come alive, and you can make that mask depict not just different emotions, but different characters, depending on how you play it and how you move it. Sometimes even very subtle movements make a big difference. So a lot of really cool, I discovered a lot of really cool things just through trying things out and experimenting and seeing what stuck and what didn't, and it was fun.
Yeah, I guess just bouncing off what Alex said in terms of choosing our script, I think that was kind of an early interest, but also an early difficulty.
Yeah.
I think each of us were very aware of the orientalizing effect of this scene, potentially. Some of the scripts we looked at had kind of overtly what I would consider racist scripts for particularly the characters who are pretending to be Persian. So one of the things we talked about really early on is how we're going to portray xenophobia and ethnic otherness in a way that doesn't reproduce modern racism, because that was very present in some of the scripts that we were looking at. So when choosing our script, we kind of combined a bunch of different scripts of the Persa, and we did just flat out change some components. We just took out a whole section where Sagaristio is explaining a very long, complicated name that he has, and he's explaining that this is a Persian custom, but the translations that we were looking at didn't reflect something that we felt we needed to reproduce on stage. We also spent a lot of time talking about costumes. We decided to do it in akin to ancient dress, but we didn't want to invoke modern racism. So one of the things we kind of talked about early on was staging the Persian passing characters in pants, because there's a connotation of effeminacy in the ancient world, but pants don't read as particularly racist in a modern context, so that was a way of like properly contextualizing that. We also thought we would put the Persian characters in different color palettes than the quote-unquote Greek characters. So the Greek characters are in white tunics, and the quote-unquote Persian characters are in brightly colored pants and darker shirts.
Rich jewel tones.
Rich jewel tones, yeah. But also not, and not doing that too much else to indicate otherness, except that the other characters respond to the quote-unquote Persian characters. Remember, these aren't actually Persian characters. These are Greek characters pretending to be Persian. But Daedalus, who's the one that's being deceived, keeps on addressing both the Virgo character and Sagaristio in these like kind of extreme ways, saying like, oh, Mr. Magnificent Persian, and then like repeatedly asking the Virgo character, where is she really from? And we felt that could kind of convey the ethnic otherness and the xenophobia without invoking modern day racism and xenophobia. We also kind of talked a lot about how we wanted to set it, like putting it in an ancient context. The masks really helped with that. We also talked about like what specific masks we should be using. So the Virgo character, it made sense for her to wear this kind of like female mask, young female mask. We had a mask that was asymmetrical for the Daedalus character that was particularly, I think due to its asymmetry, was particularly off-putting.
Yes.
And
fun to play with.
And fun to play with, and we kind of played with having that character walk around the stage, because sometimes he's like sneering and sometimes he looks like confused, very confused. And but then we also knew that Toxilus and Sagaristio were both Serii, like both enslaved characters, enslaved men, should probably have the same mask, but we had some logistical difficulties with one of the masks that we were looking at because its smile was so big that I know my chin stuck out of it.
Yeah.
And so we ended up going with the unbearded young man mask, and that could also reflect the fact that Toxilus is the young man in love, the adolescens in this play. So even though an unbearded young mask is not typically worn by enslaved characters, we wanted them to be in cahoots, we wanted them to have the same mask, and then it also reflected this aspect of Toxilus's character. So I don't know if anybody has anything else to add to that, but yeah.
That's great.
Sorry, long
No,
answers.
that was wonderful. Thank you. Because I was going to ask about the mask, and so if I can, what made you decide to go with the mask? Was it kind of the more ancient leaning aspect, or did you enjoy the idea of playing around with them? Because obviously not all groups use them.
Yeah, I think we all just agreed early on that was one of the things we wanted to get out of this institute. I think those masks were made available to us right after we had the great session with Toph Marshall and Amy Cohen, where we got to play with their masks, especially the tragedy masks. And I think we were just all really excited about that experiment. And it became challenging in ways I think we didn't anticipate, but also in the end I think easier in ways we didn't anticipate as well. It was easier to embody and distance ourselves from these characters. So I think that was my favorite part of the Institute, was getting to work with the masks.
Mine too. I was really interested in mask work. I've done mask work many, many years ago, but not much, and movement work. And so I wanted to see how those things could combine, kind of work more with that and experiment and see what that did to playing of these pieces.
And in terms of your characters, how did you divvy up the roles? How did that happen?
No, I think we tried, each of us tried reading each part during our early read-throughs, and eventually we just kind of gravitated towards one or another character. So it was maybe 2 or 3 meetings in that we finally determined which characters we were going to play. But it was nice to be able to sit with each character for a little while and see. But yeah, like in my case specifically, I'm not sure what it was, but I think the idea that the Weirgo has a very performative presence is really trying to do everything she can to put on a show, to just like really command the stage was something that really spoke to me. And also the idea that I'd be able to use a lot of sort of gestural motion and comedy to try to make the scene, to sort of bring the scene to life and to bring her particular performance to life was the particular thing about her character that I thought would be really fun and that caused me, I think, to gravitate towards her character. She opens with this long speech that kind of sets the stage for the scene. We later came to the decision to kind of change the tone of our scene to reflect the slave auction that was occurring during it, and we can talk about that more a little bit later, because that was a really pivotal decision that we made, and it changed the way that we ended up rehearsing, especially in the second and third weeks. And I'm glad we made that decision. But yeah, I think it was just sort of gravitating slowly towards particular characters. I loved the performative aspect of the Weirgo, and it turned out to be a really fun and dynamic role because of the way we ended up playing the scene.
Yeah, does anyone else want to talk about their character and kind of what made them gravitate towards it?
I'm a scholar of ancient enslavement, so that was kind of one of the things that I found interesting about the scene going in. And when we decided to make the slave auction an improv element, like we kind of wanted to reflect the improv element of Plautine comedy in the ancient context, that there'd be potentially a lot of interaction with the audience itself. And I found that really like interesting, challenging, and exciting to like, and we don't take it lightly to put on a quote unquote slave auction, and it's in a very particular context of like, we are trying to stage these scenes and see what they might have been like. And I found it interesting to try to embody the role of a person who is enslaved, but is also putting on the role of a slave auctioneer. Because this is an enslaved character pretending to be a sex trafficker, and in our case, an auctioneer. And we could talk more about how that slave auction actually ended up happening.
Yeah, definitely.
A little later, but that was what drew me to Sagristio.
I think I'm a scholar of tragedy, and so villains are something that I think a lot about villain characters. In the stuff that I work on, villain characters tend to be smarter than the rest of the characters. They tend to be underestimated, and they're usually the ones that are running the show, especially in Seneca tragedy. Daedalus is only one of those things, and I think it's that he's underestimated by the rest of the characters. And so I was interested, once we made a bunch of decisions, about making Daedalus sort of the butt of the joke for so often, where it's so easy to get the audience to laugh at him, and as a result to sort of minimize the fact that he's a sex trafficker. That is his job, that is his role, that's what he's chosen in life. And then there's a moment in which we're able to show that, no, he's been the villain the entire time, you've just been underestimating him. And he actually has a lot of power to do real harm, even in the world of Cloudnopolis. Even though later in the play he'll get beat up, and he still remains the sort of comic villain, I think, throughout the play, and everyone gets a nice laugh at his expense. But we didn't want to let that, or at least I didn't want to let that aspect of his character become too comic and thus sort of desensitized in a play where we were trying to take the implications quite seriously.
And my background is acting, directing, so I was interested in Toxilus as kind of the director of this little stage piece that they were putting on, this play, and this idea that the director doesn't always have as much control and power as they think they have. There's agency among the other characters, particularly the Virgo character, who is saying a lot more than Toxilus has ever meant for that character to say, and things are just going kind of haywire. So I thought that was really funny about that character, that he's trying to run around and kind of control everything and step back, and every time he steps back, they for some reason cannot go on, or they're going on in the wrong way, or he feels compelled to go, oh, let me just stop this for a moment and readjust something here, and yet nothing he does really works. They continue on with what they're doing. He just kind of throws things in. So I don't think he's a particularly great director. They're certainly not listening much to the kind of urging that he's providing.
Is listening to you.
Dortalus is listening. Dortalus is listening, and he just wants Dortalus to. Dortalus is like that one actor who's like hanging on every word, and you're going, you can back off, please. But Dortalus does not back off, which is a large part of the dynamic, I think, that makes that scene funny, at least for me.
So we keep talking about the auction, so maybe let's bring that to the forefront. So does someone want to explain what that was, and then we can all talk about how that materialized?
So at the midway point in our scene, as it is in the script or in like the typical translations, there's one point where Sagaristio keeps on being like, I need to sell this girl, and eventually Dortalus comes back and he says, no, I am actually interested in buying this girl. And in the scene as written, there's like kind of a back and forth, and they haggle a bit. My character proposes a price, Dortalus says, hey, that's way too much, and he goes, okay, like what about this? And then they kind of come to an agreement. And it's a ridiculous cost for an enslaved woman. If we're looking at 5th century Athens, an enslaved woman probably costs 3 to 4 minae, which is no small expense. But in comedy, you see these exaggerated prices. So you're often going to see like 20 minae. This girl is worth 20 minae. And like, that's way too much. That's not really what you should be spending on, I should maybe rephrase that. That's considered in the ancient context an inordinate amount of money to spend on an enslaved
So would be
girl.
comic.
Would be comic.
Yeah.
And we had the idea to flip it into an auction setting. One of the things I was interested in is how uncomfortable the audience might be with that. We have the Virgo character turn her back. And I had all of this like, well, it's not improv, but kind of like these like prepped lines that I was ready to say, where there's this scene of like 100, how about 100 minas? And your character says back,
Way too much.
Way too much. And I said, okay. And like we figured that would be the time. Yeah, in this economy. That would be the time we'd flip it to the audience. Say, what about you? Any big spenders out there? And I was ready to have people be a little bit uncomfortable. And I had planned to say, like, what? Does selling a girl make you uncomfortable? You know those Persian girls, they're good in the sack. And that's kind of inspired by, Top Marshall has a piece about sex trafficking. And it's 2013, sex slaves in Roman comedy, and he talks a lot about how the foreign ethnicities of enslaved women could be used as a selling point in this really highly dehumanizing effect on slave blocks. We also decided to have the Persian girl wear a sash that says Persian. I don't know if that came across in the filming.
It did, yeah.
But that was also to reflect the idea that some enslaved people, particularly in a Roman context, would be forced to wear kind of signs around their necks, advertising their skills, but also sometimes their ethnicity as a selling point. What I really appreciated from our audience, which they were all participating in a very particular context because we've all been engaging with these plots, we've all been engaging with them as theater and as social commentary. I did warn the audience beforehand there's going to be an engagement element where I'm going to flip it to the audience. And what I didn't expect, though I probably should have, is that we have a lot of people in the audience because of the context in which we've been learning who are very willing to put themselves on display and to raise a hand and to quote unquote participate and buy this slave girl.
But it took a minute.
It did take a minute.
It was awkward for a minute, and then once people started bidding,
then it kind of went up. And I didn't expect the price, because in the actual script the price goes down, right? Because it's haggling between two people. But the price started to go up.
way higher than we
Way
ever
higher.
imagined.
Yeah.
I was like, all right, we're dealing with 400, I mean, that's ridiculous,
Yeah.
400 minae. But for the sake of the scene, and then we had a point where we decided to turn it back to Daedalus. And I would say, all right, Daedalus, this is the last bid. And so it was fun to picture, like, we don't know what's going to happen in that auction element. And it went to plan in some ways, and then it didn't go to plan in other ways. And that was kind of like an interesting component.
That's improv for you.
Yeah.
I think the lead up to the auction was really important for us too as well, because like the Weirgo up until that point is trying to put on a show and trying to act in very overdramatic ways and give overdramatic speeches and fake cry really loudly, which was new and fun for me to work on.
And she feels safe.
Yeah, exactly.
Because she has her protectors.
Exactly. But as we approach the auction, and as we approach the sale, Daedalus starts to get like really handsy and creepy. And in just the space of a couple lines and one gesture, which is Daedalus brushing the fingers down the Weirgo's face, we had to transmit like our tone for this scene is about to shift dramatically. And it was tricky to do, I think in part because we're moving from a generally more comedic tone to a quite dark tone pretty quickly. But yeah, also like the speed of it, the fact that it has to happen in just a couple lines was challenging. And so it took a lot of practice, but I'm really glad we made that decision, and I think it ended up reflecting the scene that we wanted to show and that we wanted people to get out of this. So from my perspective, like at that moment, a lot of the gestural performance changes, instead of trying to sort of like command the stage, it was like, all right, we're going to hunch and hold arms like this, and turn when the slave auction begins and walk towards backstage and just be away from the whole scene. Because at that point, the sort of metaphor of it was like, the Weirgo doesn't matter in the scene anymore. Her presence is not needed. It's an exchange of money now, and that's it. And she's just sort of like become lumped into this economy of trade. So the moment before the slave auction ends up being really important for our scene too, because it's a really important tonal shift for the rest of the scene. Daedalus goes from sort of like comedic salesperson, part of a sale, to like really creepy, handsy in a very short time. And the Weirgo goes from being in the middle of a loud and proud performance to like being genuinely creeped out and no longer performing in a very short space. So it was important for us to get that just right. And the gesture of the fingers, running the fingers down the Weirgo's face, ended up being sort of like the pivot point for the rest of our scene. And the moment where my playing of the Weirgo changes pretty dramatically. And a lot of that is gestural, because I only have one line after that point. And so a lot of it is trying to present, like I started presenting like a very proud facade or whatever at the beginning of the scene, but it ends up being much more sort of like holding arms, turning around, moving to the back of the stage after that point. And one of the things that was particularly powerful is we have a moment towards the end of the scene where we are all taking a break when Daedalus goes back in to get the money, because we all have a moment where we don't have to perform. And part of that break is the Weirgo lifting the mask up. And we decided, like, what if she just doesn't lift the mask back down even when Daedalus enters back on scene? And the idea behind that was like, we aren't acting anymore. The Weirgo in particular is not part of a performance, because whatever just happened like exploded the boundaries of performance. And so we were talking earlier about masks, and one of the fun and very powerful challenges of playing the Weirgo at that moment was that I didn't have a mask to hide behind for the last 2 minutes or so of the scene. So I had to use my facial expressions to reflect the fact that, like, no, this is not a joke, and our scene is not funny anymore, and the audience needs to sit with that, and that's just the way it's going to be. and the same philosophy went into the very final moments where I take off the mask and look at the Virgo's face before walking off stage. So when we decided to mark that pivot in the middle of the scene just before the slave auction, we wanted to try to carry that energy throughout the rest of the scene, and I think that ended up being a pretty powerful interpretation.
I saw that, and it was incredible. Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, because that was my next question. Okay, so and you've already all of you, in fact, have already mentioned some challenges and triumphs, but what really sticks out to you about one of the challenges of staging this, and then one triumph? You came away from this and you thought, that was really amazing that we did this.
I would say a challenge for me was in the scene that we were just talking about, the fact that the touch, when Daedalus starts to touch the Virgo, that it is, we're really trying to play that as like a violent touch at that point, and how to do that, actually how to get that across in a way that like worked for all of us as actors on stage, but also would make the violation that this female character at the center of what has become a tragedy, even though everyone's still laughing, feels. We had a great session on intimacy coordination with Rebecca that actually really helped, I think, the two of us figure out how to do that. And so I'm very proud of what we ended up with, but that was something I was extremely anxious about, including until you got your costume.
Yeah.
Like, until we figured out that what we had planned would work with the mask and the costume, that was the thing I was the most nervous about, because it was very important to get right, to not get wrong in all of the ways that it could go wrong. And I guess a triumph for me was I really liked the two-sided mask that my character had, and being able to play him on one side of the stage as dopey and the object of a joke, and then the second the mask switches to the other side, he becomes a very self-satisfied, sinister, threatening figure. And the moment in the text that we do that is actually what I learned through this, is the only moment in Roman comedy where a Leno figure suggests that he actually has sexual access to the women that he controls and that he owns. And it's the line about tumbling with clients often enough. And so that's the moment where we also have the tone shift. And I, not as a Roman comedy person, didn't actually know that that was the one place where the Leno figure is actually revealed to be even more threatening than Plautonopoulos already allows him to be. And so playing with the mask with that, to me, felt like a great triumph, because I feel like I was able to, by staring in the mirror often enough with it, get those shifts across in his character.
No, great, thank you.
I think the masks were challenging for me. They're sometimes difficult to breathe in.
Yes.
They slip down, but there are different things you can do with them, but you just really have to spend a lot of time figuring out, if I shake my head like this, what happens to the mask? If I shake it too hard, is it going to fall down? Those types of things. But I also think that was, for me, the most rewarding part of this. I discovered how physically active the characters have to be at each and every moment.
Especially yours.
Yes,
You're
yeah.
happening a lot.
And how engaged they have to be in the scene, that it can be physically hard on your body to repeat it over and over. And this was just a short scene, so I can imagine when they're doing these in face masks and costumes and the Roman comedies were fairly short, but still much longer than our scene. That is really quite physically demanding for the performer, and I think they have to be in really good physical shape to be able to do that. And I thought that was both a challenge and something that I really enjoyed working with.
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca already mentioned corrective lenses. Cannot see very much without them, and I don't have contacts. And that was further inhibited by just like the parameters of the mask. And so one of the things that started to happen is in the early part of the scene, we are further down stage than Daedalus and Toxolis, who are eavesdropping behind us. And there's a few points where my character, it wouldn't make sense for my character to be looking at them, and also it was sometimes hard to hear because you've got this like mask around you, you're in a performance context, there's like rustling happening, and so we had to add in a few times of like, hey, Persian guy. And we kept on like hitting that beat, not only for the ethnic xenophobia that invokes, but also so I could know to turn. Because I couldn't always exactly hear, or I especially couldn't see what was happening. And so I think part of the process that we've learned in this too is that like when there's a character that says like, oh my God, the door is creaking, it's actually also a cue to the person off stage to be like, open the door now. Yeah. And adding in those little like, hey, Sagristio, or like, hey, Persian guy, was like a very helpful thing to be like, all right, turn mask, point this way, turn mask, point that way, because you really couldn't see what was happening around you. So that was like an interesting challenge. And I mean, and another challenge was like the tone. I think we really didn't know going in how we were going to hit the tone. And we kept on coming back to like, there's a lot of really disturbing things that are happening in this scene. How much do we want to play them for comedy, and how much do we want to comment on them? And I think a really key moment was the realization that you should take off the mask.
Yes.
And that we should have that like very creepy caress. The slave auction helped invoke that as well. But I think the decision to take off the Weirdo's mask was like a really key one for us to start playing with like changing the tone halfway through instead of keeping the same tone throughout.
Yeah, just to build off that. So I mentioned to like my group sometime in the first week that my greatest anxiety, because I don't have great recall, was going to be like memorizing lines, and I was really worried about that. And of course that didn't end up being an issue. That was fine, and like performance and stuff was fine. What ended up being the greatest struggle, the greatest challenge, was a thing that I honestly thought was going to be okay, or that I didn't even worry so much about in week one, which was I am a white man who's playing a Persian passing woman in the middle of a slave auction. How do you do that responsibly and thoughtfully and with sensitivity? And I think that it really did come down to the details. Like, we thought through every detail in the scene in order to make this work in a way that could basically like transmit the feeling that we wanted it to transmit to the audience, and to be something that the audience has to sit with discomfort. Like, that was we kind of like realized this is the conclusion that we have to get to with the scene. And so what ended up feeling like a really big struggle at the end of week one and early week two was sort of like, no, let's claim this. Let's like do what we can with this powerful and very difficult theme. And so while that was a challenge to sort of figure out, and even to just play, like there were moments where I was like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this responsibly. And am I allowed to play this character? If so, how do I do that with sensitivity and care? And if not, should I play somebody else? Can any of us play this character? Can any of us play any of these characters? Like, how do we? Those are hard questions, and I don't think they have easy answers. But I was really grateful that we thought really carefully through the choices we made. And so in a way that ended up being its own reward, because it was really powerful to be like, okay, the mask comes off, it's gonna stay off. I can't really react to anything else that happens in the rest of the scene except to sort of like look off into the middle distance and be like, I can't believe they're still talking about money. I can't believe they're still talking about exchange. And then just to like linger on stage with that feeling. So I think that's all like channeling the feeling of the character ended up being very rewarding in the end, even as it was tough to figure out in the middle weeks.
Could I bounce off of that a little bit too?
Please.
One of the things that kept on coming up in discussion throughout this institute is when is it appropriate to ever put on a full production of Roman comedy? And one of the things we kept on coming back to actually was the Persa. Like, the Persa came up in a lot of discussions.
The number of people who decided we shouldn't do the Persa.
Yes, and they kept people kept on saying like, really, like, should this be staged? And I think we're all, I don't want to speak for everyone, I'll say for myself, I'm in the agreement, like, I am not the person to play Sagristio in the Persa. But this was the scene that we were assigned. So like working within the parameters of like, we chose to sign up for this institute but we are not putting ourselves out there as like the best people to play these roles, but just to present one possibility of these roles was kind of an interesting thing. And at the end of this, I agree, like, this is not the scene that I think, or this is not the play that I think necessarily, in my opinion, this group of actors is best equipped to stage, but we're also working within this context and using it as like an educational opportunity. And I think the question of like, is the Persa worth staging is worthy of continued conversation. And we don't mean to present this as a solution. We mean to present this as like an opportunity to ask more questions. We're very open to criticism on the way that we staged the scene. We're open to discussion on the way we staged the scene. And I think it's worth engaging how Roman comedy deals with these themes of sex trafficking, enslavement, xenophobia, racism, misogyny, assault, like all of these things are present in the scene.
It's certainly not the only Roman comedy that's problematic.
Yes.
I think I've seen that with some of the others that we've looked at and thought, well, if I were to choose a Roman comedy to do, I don't think it would be this one. And I feel that way about the Persa, not because it's a bad play or doesn't have interesting things in it, but this one would make me very uncomfortable. I would probably gravitate to something else. I think there may be people who can figure out a way to do this, maybe an adaptation of some sort, a rewriting of parts of it. It's probably not me. Like I think it needs different people to do that, but as part of the Institute, I think it's an academic exercise in some ways, and meant to open discussion and meant to have this moment for people to look at it and start thinking about it and talking about it, rather than any definitive, this is how it should be done kind of statement that we're making.
Thank you so much. And as you said, this is a very difficult scene to watch. There are obviously others in this institute that are equally difficult to watch. And so I think, as you said, opening up this discussion and getting it started is just so valuable. Is there anything else any of you would like to add? Any advice, any parting thoughts, concluding thoughts before we officially say it's a wrap?
I feel like we've said
Yeah.
what we want to say.
Well, thank you so very much for joining me, and stay tuned for the footage of this scene that you'll be able to watch. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.